This is the new base model 14-inch MacBook Pro, and the reason I decided to start my coverage of the new M2 chips with this is because of one very simple reason. This is the double-binned MacBook Pro, which means you get 2 less CPU cores and 3 less GPU cores. But critically, that means this has a 10-core CPU and a 16-core GPU. Well, you know what else also has that exact configuration? That's right, it's the regular M1 Pro 14-inch from 2021. And this, I think, is a really interesting comparison. So let me go ahead and get this thing set up, and let's dive into it. Speak of the devil, they're all set up, and let's go ahead and start out with Cinebench R23, because of course, we've got 10-core CPUs in both of these silver machines that I can't even really tell apart anymore, so we might as well just go ahead and start them up because the results are going to be the same, right? What a crazy coincidence. So what are we looking at? Well, the M1 Pro over here did 12,141, and the double-binned M2 Pro scored 11,754. So I guess they're not the same, right? Well, this is an important point that I want you guys to keep in mind because I've seen a lot of people that have said, hey, the new base model 14-inch MacBook Pro is just a full M1 Pro for less money. But that's not the case, because this is not the same core configuration as this. They're both 10 cores, yes, but this has 6 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores instead of 8 performance cores and 2 efficiency cores. So that slight difference that we see there is because there are less performance cores. The same thing shows up here in Blender Classroom on the CPU test. 7 minutes and 5 seconds on the M1 Pro, 7 minutes and 40 seconds on the M2 Pro. So, if there's a difference in the CPUs, what about the GPUs? There's no performance or efficiency there. They should be roughly the same, unless the M2 Pro is better. Well, we're gonna find out with the help of 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme. This is a benchmark that runs on iPhone, iPad, and Apple Silicon Mac, and it really accurately uses every single one of the cores. Aha, and wouldn't you know it, we got a score of 10,268 on the M1 Pro, and 11,105 on the M2 Pro. So it looks like even though we have the same number of cores, these M2 cores seem to be juiced up a little bit, and they are performing better. Now to double check, I fired up the Blender Classroom GPU cycle and ran them on both devices with the Metal API. And things got really interesting here. The M1 Pro took 3 minutes and 26 seconds, the M2 Pro took 2 minutes and 28 seconds, nearly a full minute faster. That's about 30%. This is pretty strong evidence that the M2 cores are actually faster. And again, here in GFX Bench, I ran the Aztec, Manhattan, and T-Rex benchmarks off screen, and we saw our scores increase from 71 to 78, 901 to 1,014, and 1,606 to 1,815. That's increases of about 8 to 12%. So an interesting set of results there. I'm impressed that Apple seems to have gotten about 8 to 10% more performance out of the exact same number of GPU cores. And remember, this is the double-binned MacBook Pro, so all of the other configurations of M2 Pro are going to have even more cores. And given that the cores are about 8% faster, that should be pretty interesting. Now, in terms of the CPU, honestly, it's not a huge difference. Given that we have the same core count, but switch out 2 of our cores here for efficiency instead of performance, you would think possibly that there would be a bigger difference, but it seems to be quite minor. Now, one thing that I did notice is, to my ear, the M2 Pro sounds a little bit quieter, probably because we have fewer performance cores pushing away. So, fan speed's a little bit lower, but surface temperatures Well, I took some readings and they're about the same. 35 degrees Celsius on both of these things at the top of the keyboard right below the screen. That's the hottest point, and really that is not uncomfortable to touch. So unless you have these two side by side, I don't think you would notice the CPU performance gap. I don't think you would notice the thermal gap, and I don't think you would be able to hear the fans. That's pretty encouraging considering that this is the base model and this was last year's upgraded model. But given that we have a slightly weaker CPU and a slightly stronger GPU, what happens if you put those two together and we do a Final Cut render, for example? That's gonna lean pretty heavily on the media encode engines, but it should use the GPU and the CPU as well. So I fired up a 40-minute 4K 60 FPS clip. Now, this was a really interesting test because almost immediately I noticed that the M2 Pro started pulling ahead. This is not what I expected to see, because remember, we're talking about the double binned SoC versus the not at all binned M1 Pro. I expected them to be very close. But by the time the render finished, it took 9 minutes and 16 seconds on the M2 Pro base model, and it took 10 minutes and 5 seconds on the M1 Pro. That's about 50 seconds faster, and it's not a super huge percentage increase, but it is really impressive given that this is the double binned base model and this is not. And spoiler alert, the M2 Pro actually outperformed the M1 Max. That's right, my fully loaded $4,000 16-inch MacBook Pro, that took 10 minutes and 4 seconds. That was a weak spot that I had found last year with the M1 series. The Pro and the Max in Final Cut rendering are basically identical. And so now we have the M2 Pro coming in here and improving not only on the M1 Pro, but on the M1 Max as well. Now, tomorrow we're going to be testing the M2 Max to see if the trend continues, but this is great news. And all of this is despite the hysteria that I've started to see that Apple is throttling the SSDs. I do want to address that for a second, and yes, the SSDs in the base model 512GB are actually slower than last year's M1 Pro. You can see last year's SSD is pushing nearly 5,000 megabytes per second read-write, whereas here on our 512 M2 Pro, we're looking at more like 2,500 to 3,000. So it does appear that the new SSDs that Apple is using in this base model are a little bit slower than they were, about 40%. But I do want to mention that this is not something that almost anyone would notice. I know that there have been some videos talking about the M2 Mac Mini being slower than the M1 Mac Mini, and obviously we had this issue with the M2 MacBook Air and the M2 MacBook Pro and their base 256GB configurations. And I agree back then that that was unfortunate. Those SSDs are genuinely pretty slow. But this is 3GB per second. And yes, it is slower, but I would not call this slow at all. Not to mention the fact that if you are doing serious work that requires you to be reading and writing to your SSD all the time, well, let's be honest, you probably need more than half a terabyte. So I don't want to excuse Apple for making the SSDs slower, but let's get some perspective here. Is this really an important issue? I would argue that in the case of the M2 Mac Mini and the M2 MacBook Air, it is unfortunate that those SSDs are fairly slow. But here, I really don't think it matters. I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. But overall, if we zoom out and look at both of these machines, you gotta remember that I'm comparing the $2,000 base model to the $2,500 mid-tier model from last year. So you can look at this as a slight increase in performance accompanied by a $300 price drop, or you can look at it as a pretty sizable increase in performance if you compare base model to base model. Either way you cut it, I think this is a great machine, and the base model MacBook Pro, as well as that fantastic Mac Mini that we tore apart yesterday, they just got a lot better. Now, of course, I'm gonna be testing the regular 19-core GPU version of the M2 Pro, and I've got a video coming tomorrow on the M2 Max, so we'll see if the trend continues. But my overall take is, obviously, if you have one of the M1 Pro or Max machines, you don't need to do this upgrade, right? Only YouTubers like myself are the ones that are gonna be getting the latest one every single year, and that's because we review them and compare them, and it's important to have the latest gear. But if you have one of these guys, you don't need one of these guys. That being said, if you haven't pulled the trigger yet on Apple Silicon, well, now you have one more reason to do so. So, I'm very curious to know what you guys think about this comparison. Are you pleased with the way that this MacBook performs? Let me know in the comments below, and of course, get subscribed. I've got a ton of more content coming your way. And with that, I will see you guys in the next video, which is gonna be very soon. So, see you soon.